How did 77 young men from the suburbs of Melbourne and Sydney, boys so poorly prepared that their own army called them chocolate soldiers who would melt in the heat of battle, convince the most feared military force in the Pacific that they had fought? 1,200? How did teenagers who arrived in a jungle they had never seen, carrying equipment designed for the wrong continent, digging their defensive positions with bayonets and bully beef tins and bare hands, become the soldiers who shattered the one belief that was paralyzing every Allied commander from Burma to the Solomon Islands? The belief that the Japanese army could not be beaten on land? Before we go any further, tell me in the comments what you already know about Kokoda, because I want to understand how far this story has actually traveled, and what you are about to discover is going to change the way you understand who really turned the tide of the Pacific War. Forget what the textbooks told you. Today we are opening files that a Japanese general used to explain the worst defeat of his career, that a British Field Marshal used to inspire his own soldiers half a world away, and that the Australian government let quietly recede from public memory for reasons that become obvious the moment you understand what they reveal. This story has been sitting in archives and granite, and the memories of old men in Japan for 80 years. It comes out now. To understand what happened in the jungles of Papua in the second half of 1942, you first have to understand what the world looked like in the months before a single shot was fired on the Kokoda Track. The catastrophe that followed had not been born from the mistakes of individual officers or the collapse of any single plan. It had been constructed over years from a fundamental collision between an empire that believed it could not be stopped and a continent that had run out of options for stopping it. The men who would fight on the Kokoda Track did not choose that ground. The ground chose them because there was nothing else left. The Japanese military machine had swept through Southeast Asia with a speed and efficiency that stunned every Allied strategist who watched it happen. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress and the cornerstone of British Imperial defense in the Pacific, fell on the 15th of February, 1942. The surrender handed nearly 15,000 Australian soldiers into Japanese captivity, the single greatest military humiliation in Australian history. 4 days later, on the 19th of February, Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin in the largest foreign attack ever carried out on Australian soil, killing more than 250 people and destroying the port facilities that Australia depended on for its northern defenses. The Philippines had fallen, Indonesia was taken, Burma was collapsing. The Japanese had moved through the British Empire's finest forces, troops who had trained for decades, who carried sophisticated equipment, who fought with the institutional confidence of armies that had never questioned their own supremacy and had broken them like dry wood in a fire that showed no sign of burning itself out. This was not propaganda. The fear had a rational foundation built on observable evidence. Japanese soldiers were trained night fighters, masters of jungle infiltration, experts in the flanking maneuver that bypassed defensive strongpoints and struck supply lines instead, leaving defenders isolated and confused and unable to respond to threats they could not locate. They had refined these techniques against the Chinese over years of brutal campaigning, tested them against the British in Malaya, where they had moved faster than any defensive plan could account for, and deployed them against the Americans in the Philippines, where the result was catastrophic. Every time, the outcome had been the same. The belief in Japanese invincibility had grown a little taller with each successive campaign, and the willingness of Allied commanders to believe their own troops could counter it had shrunk proportionally, until by mid-1942, it had become something close to an axiom of Allied strategic thinking. Japanese soldiers in jungle terrain could not be beaten. Australia in 1942 was simultaneously more vulnerable and more alone than at any point in its entire history as a nation. Prime Minister John Curtin had broken with British tradition, breaking in truth with the entire structure of imperial loyalty that had defined Australian strategic thinking since Federation, and demanded the return of Australian Imperial force troops from the Middle East and North Africa. Churchill resisted. Britain needed those soldiers against Rommel in the desert, and the argument that followed was fierce, the relationship between the two governments damaged, and the physical return of those men agonizingly slow. The best Australian soldiers, veterans of the deserts of Libya and the brutal mountain campaigns of Greece and the long siege of Tobruk, were weeks or months away from home. What remained to defend the northern approaches to the continent was the militia. Young men, many barely 18 years old, poorly trained, under-equipped, lacking experience, and held in open contempt by the regular army they nominally belonged to. The veterans called them chokos, after George Bernard Shaw's play about a man who refuses to fight, meaning they would melt when the heat of real combat came. They were also called koalas, not to be exported or shot at. The contempt was nearly total across the regular army. It would prove to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in the entire history of the Pacific War, because those boys were about to do something that the regular army's finest units in other theaters had not managed to do. The strategic stakes around Port Moresby, the capital of the Australian territory of Papua on the southern coast of New Guinea, could not have been higher for either side. From its airfields, Japan could bomb northern Queensland at will, interdict Allied shipping across the western Pacific, and establish the air superiority required for any further operations against the Australian mainland. The Japanese Navy had been pushing for an outright invasion of the continent itself throughout the first half of the year, proposals that reached Admiral Yamamoto himself and which he endorsed with enthusiasm, and only the Japanese Army's careful calculation that 10 divisions would be needed to permanently hold Australia prevented the plan from advancing beyond the level of serious debate at the highest levels of Imperial command. The threat was never abstract. It was argued with genuine strategic intent by some of the most powerful officers in Japan's military hierarchy. What blocked a seaborne assault on Port Moresby was not Australian military strength, it was Allied intelligence. Code breakers working under conditions of extreme secrecy had cracked the Japanese naval cipher, and in the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May of 1942, an Allied carrier force intercepted the Japanese invasion fleet before it could reach its objective and land its troops on the southern coast of New Guinea. The Japanese won the naval exchange in technical terms, but lost enough aircraft that the amphibious plan had to be abandoned entirely. With the sea route permanently closed, Japan's high command issued its new order. Port Moresby would be taken overland, through the mountains, along a track that Japanese staff officers had studied from maps and explorer accounts and believed to be a viable military route. And the man assigned to lead that overland advance had private doubts about it from the very beginning. The South Seas Detachment, built around the 144th Infantry Regiment raised in Kochi City in Japan, was not a garrison force or a second-line unit assembled from whatever manpower was available. It was a proven amphibious assault formation with a distinguished recent record, veterans of the successful capture of Guam and the overwhelming attack on Rabaul that had opened Japan's southern campaign. Its commander, Major General Tomitaro Hori, born on the 7th of November, 1890, in Hyogo Prefecture, had graduated from the Imperial Army Academy in 1911, served through the brutal campaigns in China, and built over 3 decades a reputation as a plain-spoken and capable officer who kept his personal headquarters close to the front line and was genuinely respected by his men because they knew he shared their danger. He had issued, on his own authority, and without being specifically ordered to do so, a personal guide to soldiers in the South Seas that forbade looting, the violation of women, the burning of civilian property, and the unnecessary killing of local inhabitants. He had witnessed atrocities in China and tried, through this quiet act of personal conscience and command authority, to prevent them from following his force into Papua. He was not a simple man and not a simple antagonist, and that complexity matters enormously for understanding the full weight of everything that happened to him and to the men under his command. When the Japanese Navy informed Horii that the Coral Sea battle had been a great victory, which was the polite fiction designed to paper over the strategic reversal that had just canceled his carefully planned seaborne landing, he replied with the dry and precise sarcasm of a man who understood exactly what had just been decided about his future. He said that he offered his deepest congratulations for such an unprecedented victory, and confirmed that he understood they would return to Rabaul. The seaborne assault was cancelled. The overland campaign through the Owen Stanleys was now mandatory. He began preparing to execute an order he believed was likely to fail, because that is what professional soldiers do when the orders come down and the alternatives have been removed. His force landed at Buna and Gona on the northern Papuan coast on the 21st of July, 1942. Initially 1,800 men, growing over the following weeks to 8,500. They carried 16 days of rations each, plus 18 kilograms of rice per man, plus mountain artillery pieces that 940 men would have to physically haul up, and over 8,000-foot passes through jungle that had never been properly mapped by anyone who had crossed it in military formation. Japanese intelligence had reported a road between the coast and Kokoda village that was suitable for motor vehicles, which would have transformed the logistical challenge of the advance. Hundreds of bicycles had been landed at Bunagona, specifically to exploit this road and speed the movement of troops inland toward Kokoda. Within days of moving off the beach and into the jungle, the bicycles were abandoned where they stood, because the road was a single-file foot track through terrain that had broken the body of every outsider who had ever seriously attempted to cross it. The intelligence had been catastrophically wrong about the road. It had made equally wrong assumptions about the defenders waiting on the other side of the mountains. The Kokoda Track runs 96 kilometers through the Owen Stanley Range, but those distances carry no meaning until you understand what kind of 96 kilometers they represent. Soldiers who fought there measured the track not in distance, but in days, because the terrain made kilometers irrelevant as a unit of human experience. The trail climbs to 2,190 meters at its highest point around Mount Bellamy, and the total elevation change accumulated over the full length of the track is approximately 5,000 meters gained and lost through terrain that shifts between high-altitude moss forest, where temperatures drop toward freezing and leeches fall from the canopy in thousands onto anything that passes beneath, and mosquito-ridden coastal swamps where the heat is absolute and the ground dissolves into mud that can swallow a man to the knee with each step. Visibility in the densest sections of the jungle is 20 meters or less in any direction. Combat here was described by Australian veterans who had also fought in North Africa and the Mediterranean as night fighting, even when it occurred in the middle of a tropical afternoon, because the canopy was so dense and so layered that no meaningful light reached the floor where the men were fighting and bleeding and dying. Lieutenant Don Simonson of the 39th Battalion spoke for every Australian who first encountered the track when he said simply that they moved into a country that they had never dreamt of before. What passed through him in that first moment of contact with the jungle was not fear in any ordinary sense of the word. It was the recognition of something fundamentally alien, a physical world that had no relationship to anything he had come from, and no interest whatsoever in accommodating the equipment and the training and the assumptions that he had brought with him into it. By the time the entire campaign concluded months later, 4,857 Australians had been evacuated from the theater sick, more than half of every person who served in the entire operation suffering from malaria, dysentery, scrub typhus, dengue fever, and tropical ulcers that spread across living flesh with a speed that shocked even experienced medical officers who had never seen the diseases of this jungle before. The track killed men without a single shot being fired, at a sustained rate that alarmed senior commanders who believed they had understood what difficult campaigning in difficult terrain actually looked like. Into this landscape, the militia boys of the 39th Australian Infantry Battalion were sent in July of 1942. Their average age was 18.5 years old. They had been formed in Victoria in October and November of the previous year from volunteers who had answered a call they did not fully understand the implications of, trained on equipment designed for a climate that bore no resemblance to the Owen Stanleys, issued khaki uniforms that stood out against the green of the jungle like pale flags, marking their position to anyone watching from concealment. They arrived in Port Moresby in January of 1942 and spent the following months in facilities that were inadequate by any reasonable standard, attempting to prepare for a campaign that no one in their chain of command had properly planned for, properly resourced, or properly imagined. They had no artillery support whatsoever, not a single gun for the entire track campaign, while the Japanese had invested the enormous physical effort of hauling mountain howitzers over the Owen Stanleys, specifically because their commanders understood what artillery and mountain terrain would mean for the infantry fighting around it. The Australians dug their defensive positions at Isurava using bayonets and the curved steel of their own helmets and whatever else came to hand, because they had left most of their entrenching tools behind in the withdrawal from positions further north. Their starting strength was approximately 1,500 men, which sounds substantial until you understand how quickly the jungle and the enemy and the disease together would work to reduce it. The Papuan Infantry Battalion fought alongside the 39th from the beginning, local soldiers serving under Australian officers who possessed the kind of intimate knowledge of the terrain that no amount of foreign training or preparation could replicate. These men knew the jungle in the way that people know a landscape they have lived inside their whole lives, and their contribution to every phase of the campaign was essential and consistently undervalued by the histories that followed. The Papuan carriers, who became known universally among Australians on the track as the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, sustained the entire fighting force in ways that no official accounting has ever fully captured. They carried supplies up the mountain on paths that destroyed the feet of men who had not grown up walking them, and they carried wounded soldiers down on stretchers with a tenderness and a dedication that the men they were carrying never forgot for the rest of their lives. Captain Henry Stewart, regimental medical officer of the 2nd 16th Battalion, wrote of them that with 4 men each side of a stretcher, they took it in turns to sleep and to watch, giving each wounded man whatever food, drink, or comfort there might be. Without those carriers making their relentless journeys up and down the track in both directions, through rain and disease and the threat of Japanese ambush, the Kokoda campaign would have collapsed as a viable military operation before any of its decisive battles were ever fought. They deserve a great deal more than the footnote they typically receive in histories that were written from a distance. The commanding officer who would lead the 39th Battalion through the campaign's defining weeks arrived at Isurava on the 16th of August, 1942, and what he found there when he arrived was something that would have broken a less experienced man. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor, decorated veteran of the campaigns in Libya, Greece, and Crete, holder of the Distinguished Service Order and the Military Cross earned in those earlier desperate fights, had rebuilt shattered units from the ruins of campaigns that had destroyed other formations. He had been through enough to recognize fighting men in the absolute extremity of their endurance. When he arrived at Isurava and assessed with a professional and compassionate eye what he found waiting for him, he wrote the passage that has become, in the decades since, the emotional center of every serious account of the Kokoda campaign. He described the pathetically young warriors of the 39th as being in poor physical shape, worn out by strenuous fighting and exhausting movement, and weakened by lack of food and sleep and shelter, with many having literally come to a standstill. And he noted that practically every day torrential rain fell all through the afternoon and night, cascading into their cheerless weapons pits and soaking the clothes they wore, the only ones they had. Every word of that assessment was clinically accurate. He kept every one of them in the line regardless, because the situation gave him no better option. On the 29th of July, 1942, before Honor arrived and before the reinforcing veterans of the 214th Battalion appeared on the track, 77 men of B Company, 39th Battalion, had stood on an escarpment above Kokoda village and defended it against an attack by the full 1st Battalion of the 144th Regiment. The numbers at that first engagement are confirmed by Senshi Sosho, the 102-volume official Japanese history of the Pacific War, compiled by Japan's Defense Studies Institute from the complete operational archive of the Japanese military, including command diaries, unit records, and the accounts of senior commanders who were present at the decisions being documented. Revisionist historians have since made strenuous arguments that the force ratios at that first engagement were roughly equal, and that the odds against the Australians were not as extreme as the standard accounts suggest. Senshi Sosho settles the question without ambiguity. Lieutenant Colonel Tsukamoto's complete battalion occupied Kokoda on the morning of the 29th of July, between 500 and 700 battle-hardened veterans against 77 militia boys from the suburban streets of Melbourne and Sydney. The Japanese attacked at night, which was their preferred and most effective method. 400 soldiers rushed forward shouting and chanting to break the morale of whatever defenders they expected to find, deploying the assault doctrine that had worked from Malaya to the Philippines and in every jungle engagement they had fought. The 77 Australians in their hastily dug rifle pits opened fire with automatic weapons and hurled grenades into the darkness at shapes they could barely distinguish from the surrounding undergrowth. Men fought hand-to-hand with bayonets, rifle butts, and fists when the Japanese closed to distances where weapons became less useful than brute physical force. Lieutenant Colonel William Owen, commanding the Australian defense, leaned over a defensive parapet to observe where the attack was pressing most heavily and was shot through the head by a Japanese sniper or rifleman in the darkness. He died on that escarpment above Kokoda and became the first Australian commanding officer killed in the New Guinea campaign. The Japanese broke through the Australian position and seized the village and its strategically crucial airfield. Before the last Australians completed their withdrawal into the surrounding jungle and rubber plantation, one man made a decision to stay behind. Private Snowy Parr hid himself at the edge of Kokoda village and waited in the gray and misty light before dawn, while Japanese soldiers celebrated their night's victory among the buildings they had captured. He waited with the patience of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and why it needed to be done. When 24 Japanese soldiers had gathered in a group within 60 yards of his concealed position, he raised his Bren gun and emptied a full 30-round magazine into them. He killed 20 of them where they stood. Then he slipped back through the rubber trees at the edge of the village and rejoined the retreating Australians, the very last man to leave Kokoda that morning. 6 Australians were killed in the entire defense. 5 were wounded. The Japanese suffered 95 casualties in taking a position held by 77 men. Then, the Japanese filed their official report on the engagement, and the report stated to their commanders that they believed they had faced as many as 1,200 Australians in the defense of Kokoda. The actual number was 77. Nobody corrected the record. The Japanese military system absorbed that discrepancy and moved on to the next phase of the campaign, carrying with it a miscalculation that had already, at the very first moment of contact, begun to fracture the certainty on which everything they were planning to do in Papua was constructed. Japanese Sergeant Imanishi Sadaharu, interviewed many decades after the war about his personal experience at Kokoda, was still puzzled by the memory when he spoke of it. He said that no one knew there was a hill. The formal Japanese military assessment recorded after the battle and preserved in the operational archive was precise and revealing. The Australians were skilled marksmen and expert grenade throwers who possessed greater fighting spirit than the British, the Filipinos, or the Americans. An Imperial army that had swept through half of Southeast Asia without suffering a significant check had just issued its official formal assessment of the colonial militia it had defeated in its first engagement in Papua. It was the most dangerous compliment the Japanese military knew how to give, and they had given it unreservedly to boys who had been dismissed by their own side as soldiers who would never be worth taking seriously. They had taken Kokoda village and its airfield. The weeks ahead would not become easier as the Japanese force climbed into the Owen Stanleys. The weeks between the fall of Kokoda in late July and the opening of the Battle of Isurava at the end of August were weeks of continuous physical retreat for the Australians and of unbroken advance for the Japanese, and for both sides, simultaneously, they were weeks of destruction inflicted not by combat, but by the mountain itself. The Japanese supply system was fracturing under the weight of what was being demanded of it before the decisive battles even began. Soldiers who had landed on the beach carrying 16 days of rations had consumed most of them long before they reached the mountain passes. The convoy of supply ships that was scheduled to arrive at Bunagona by the 20th of September was delayed by circumstances that the Japanese operational record describes plainly as the breaking of the supply mechanism. By the time Hori's leading elements had crossed the Owen Stanleys and were pushing south toward Port Moresby, the daily rice ration for each man had been cut to 180 milliliters, a quantity barely sufficient to keep a resting man technically alive, and nowhere near sufficient to sustain a soldier in active mountain combat in tropical conditions. The Australians were not better supplied. They were differently desperate in ways that the terrain made unavoidable for both sides. Moving supplies forward along the track relied entirely on Papuan carriers, pack animals, and from August onward, the irregular and often inaccurate airdrops that American transport aircraft attempted through dense jungle canopy at altitude. Military planners subsequently calculated that approximately 1/4 of the supplies that were committed to the air delivery effort actually reached frontline troops in usable condition. Men fought for weeks at the physical edge of starvation, while simultaneously suffering from tropical diseases that their field medical system had no adequate treatment for, and that spread through units with a speed that no quarantine measure was capable of controlling in jungle conditions. Private Stuart Clark of the 2nd 14th Battalion kept a diary throughout his time on the track. Its entries carry the physical and emotional weight of every man who served in the entire campaign, distilled into the simplest possible language. Heavy rain and cold, still waiting, wet through all night, no dry clothes, always thinking of home. The whole experience reduced to fragments, because fragments were what remained of everything else. The reinforcements that Maroubra Force needed most arrived in the second half of August, climbing the track from the south. The 214th Battalion was not a militia unit and bore no resemblance to one. These were veterans of campaigns in the western desert, men who had held the Tobruk perimeter through a siege that lasted months and had become famous around the world, who had retreated through the mountains of Greece under continuous German air attack, who carried in their bearing the particular steady confidence of soldiers who have already faced what they believed would kill them and discovered that they could survive it. They moved up the Kokoda Track and arrived at Isurava exhausted from the mountain climb, company by company, piecemeal, as the Japanese were already beginning the preliminary probing attacks that signaled their main assault was imminent. The first company reached the Australian position in the middle of the afternoon of the 26th of August. The remaining companies followed over the next 2 days, each group moving directly into the defensive line as it arrived, without any period of rest before the fighting that was already beginning around them. An officer among the arriving veterans described passing the men of the 39th on the track as the militia boys moved rearward. They were emaciated beyond anything he had seen in the western desert, their uniforms reduced to shreds, held together by mud and habit, their eyes hollowed out by weeks of inadequate sleep and food, and the particular mental exhaustion that comes from fighting without ever knowing when the next attack will come. It was a sobering sight for men who believed they already had a comprehensive understanding of what genuinely hard conditions looked like. The 26th of August, 1942. 2 events were launched simultaneously on the same morning by a Japanese command that had designed them as coordinated strikes against the same strategic objective from different directions. At Isurava, on the Kokoda Track, the South Seas Detachment launched its full offensive assault against the Australian defensive positions on the ridge. At Milne Bay, on the eastern tip of Papua, 250 kilometers away, along the Papuan coast, Japanese naval infantry were simultaneously coming ashore in darkness to attack an airfield that the Japanese High Command had been told was lightly defended. The 2 battles, fought at the same time for the same ultimate objective of Port Moresby, have been separated by memory and by the long shadow that the Kokoda Track casts across Australian national consciousness. What happened at Milne Bay on those same days was, in its immediate strategic consequences, the more decisive event of the 2, and it deserves to be understood in that context. At Isurava, the Japanese moved forward approximately 2,500 strong, supported by mountain gun artillery, that the Australians defending the ridge had absolutely nothing to answer with. Machine gun fire ripped through the tree line along the Australian perimeter. The Japanese charged in waves across the open ground in front of the Australian positions, towards soldiers who should, by any rational and objective military calculation, have already collapsed from the accumulated weight of weeks of exhaustion and disease and inadequate supply before the assault even began. The Australian line held against the first wave. The Japanese committed 2 reserve battalions the next day, another 1,200 men, bringing their attacking force to approximately 3,700 against fewer than 500 Australians, a number that grew slowly and piecemeal as the companies of the 2nd 14th Battalion moved into position as they arrived from the march. The mathematics of the engagement were utterly unambiguous in what they predicted. The outcome should have been determined before the serious fighting even started. Through the 28th of August, combat was continuous and without any meaningful pause. No break in the fighting, no rest for either side, no mercy from the terrain or the enemy, or the rain that fell every afternoon and turned the ground into a surface that made every movement a physical effort. Both battalions were under extreme and sustained pressure. Probing attacks coming through the night in heavy tropical rain, hand-to-hand combat occurring on the right flank as men grappled in the mud and the darkness for the control of positions that were measured in meters of jungle, rather than in any unit that appears on a conventional military map. Honor kept the utterly exhausted men of the 39th in the defensive line, alongside the relatively fresher 214th, because he understood with professional clarity what was coming, and because he could not ask one battalion to face it without the men who already understood this specific ground, and what surviving on it every day actually required. The 29th of August was the crisis point of the entire Kokoda campaign, the moment on which everything else turned. The Japanese attacked with approximately 6 full battalions simultaneously. They broke through C Company of the 214th Battalion, punching a gap in the Australian perimeter that threatened to fold the entire defensive position and open the track to an advance that nothing between Isurava and Port Moresby would have been able to stop. The commanders at every level were reaching for whatever options remained to them. It was in that specific moment, at the worst point of the worst day of the entire campaign, that Private Bruce Steele Kingsbury stepped forward without being ordered to do so and volunteered to join the counterattack that was being hastily assembled. He was 23 years old. Before the war came to his city and his country, he had been a real estate agent from Essendon in Victoria. He was one of the very few survivors of a platoon that had just been overrun and largely destroyed in the Japanese breakthrough. He took the Bren gun, which was the heaviest automatic weapon his platoon had carried, and he charged the Japanese force that had broken through the line. The official Victoria Cross citation states that he rushed forward firing the Bren gun from his hip through terrific machine gun fire and succeeded in clearing a path through the enemy, continuing to sweep enemy positions with his fire and inflicting an extremely high number of casualties. Those words are accurate in every particular and completely inadequate as a description of what he actually did and what it cost him. Eyewitnesses who survived the engagement and were interviewed afterward described his action as having a profound effect on both the Australians watching and the Japanese he was attacking. That his individual charge halted the Japanese momentum at the moment it was most dangerous, bought the time that was needed to restore the line and close the gap, and in those few minutes of individual fury, at the absolute edge of what a human being can do under fire, may have saved the entire Australian defensive position at Isurava. A Japanese sniper killed him. He fell at the edge of the gap he had torn through the advancing Japanese force, still holding the Bren gun that had done it. Bruce Kingsbury was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. It was the first Victoria Cross awarded on Australian territory in the entire Second World War, and it was earned not by a career soldier or a celebrated officer, but by a real estate agent from Essendon who charged an Imperial army alone with a machine gun, firing from his hip, and made the charge count. He was not the only man who held that line with everything he had. Corporal Charlie McCallum, a farmer from South Gippsland in Victoria, accounted for 40 Japanese soldiers at Isurava, using both a Bren gun and a Tommy gun, before the position he was defending was overrun. He was recommended for the Victoria Cross for what he did that day. He received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He was killed at Brigade Hill a week after Isurava, before any of the recognition reached him. His mother kept that Distinguished Conduct Medal in her handbag for the rest of her life. She carried it with her every day until she died, in the way that people carry the only physical thing they have left of someone they cannot stop mourning. Corporal John Metzen had his ankle shattered by a Japanese bullet during the fighting at Isurava. He refused to be placed on a stretcher and carried out by the Papuan bearers who would have taken him. He padded his hands and knees with whatever material he could find and crawled, not for 1 day, not for 2 days, but for 3 consecutive weeks through jungle that was partly in Japanese hands, with a group of other wounded men who had been cut off from the main track and from any realistic prospect of rescue. He kept encouraging and steadying the men around him through those 3 weeks when his own body had nothing left to offer them, and when the pain from the shattered ankle must have been beyond what ordinary language can describe. The Japanese eventually located the group. They executed John Metzen on the 4th of October, 1942. He was posthumously awarded the British Empire Medal, a small decoration for 3 weeks of crawling through enemy-controlled jungle on a shattered ankle, keeping wounded men alive through nothing but stubborn will and the refusal to accept that the situation was hopeless. By the 30th of August, with the right flank broken and the very real threat of complete encirclement becoming imminent, Honor and Lieutenant Colonel Albert Key made the command decision to withdraw from Isurava. When the 2nd 14th Battalion assembled at Alola the following morning and counted itself, 172 personnel were unaccounted for, beyond those who had been confirmed dead and wounded in the fighting. Key himself was killed shortly after the withdrawal, believed to have died around the 10th of September, the density and confusion of the jungle making certainty about precise dates and circumstances of death almost impossible to establish from the surviving records. The Japanese had won the ground at Isurava after 4 days of fighting. Marubra Force had survived the battle as a coherent formation capable of continued fighting. That distinction, which seemed relatively small in the immediate chaos of the withdrawal, would determine the entire subsequent course of the campaign. On the 6th of September, 1942, at Minari village on the Kokoda Track south of the fighting, Ralph Honor stood before what physically remained of the 39th Battalion. The men in front of him were barely 19 years old. They were emaciated in ways that photographs from the period cannot fully convey. Their uniforms were fragments held together by mud and by the force of habit. They had been fighting without adequate rest or food or medical support, in conditions that the military training of any nation in the world at that time did not adequately prepare any human being to survive indefinitely. Honor told them that he did not know many of them by name, but that he knew them. He said they had met at Isurava and had fought together every step of the way from there to here. He told them that the battle they had fought for the track may have just saved their nation. He said they had seen things in that place that no man should witness, and that some of those things they must find a way to forget. He finished by telling them that history would remember them, and that in the years to come, others would wish that they had shared their conviction. They stood in the rain at Minari village and listened to him say it. Most of them were 19 years old. History did remember them. It simply took a great deal longer than those men deserved, and the delay was not an accident. On that same morning in late August, when Isurava was beginning, 250 kilometers to the east, along the Papuan coast, the Japanese trap at Milne Bay had already been sprung in precisely the wrong direction, with consequences that neither side had fully anticipated. The Japanese had planned the Milne Bay operation with the comprehensive confidence that had characterized every successful campaign since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Their intelligence reported that the airfield on the eastern tip of Papua was defended by 2 or 3 companies of Allied troops, a light garrison that could be overwhelmed quickly and decisively by a determined and well-executed amphibious assault. The forces assembled to take it were among the finest available, the 5th Corps and 3rd Corps. Special naval landing forces were elite naval infantry deployed by Japan only for its most critical and most operationally demanding missions. 2 light tanks were included in the landing force, the same model that had caused panic and broken Allied defensive lines in Malaya and elsewhere in the Pacific. Allied codebreakers, who had already read and acted on the Japanese naval plans for the seaborne assault on Port Moresby, had read these Milne Bay plans with equal clarity and had acted on them with considerable advance preparation. Major General Cyril Close, a careful and methodical officer who had commanded the Anzac Corps artillery in Greece and held the Distinguished Service Order and Military Cross from the First World War, had spent weeks building a garrison at Milne Bay that bore no resemblance whatsoever to what the Japanese expected to find waiting for them when they came ashore. When Japanese naval infantry landed on the night of the 25th of August, they were entering a position defended by 8,824 Allied troops, 7,459 Australians, and 1,365 Americans. Squadrons 75 and 76 of the Royal Australian Air Force, flying P-40 Kitty Hawk fighters, were operating from the very airstrip the Japanese had come to capture. The Kitty Hawks found the Japanese landing barges from Burma, while those barges were still at sea, and destroyed all 7 of them before they could deliver their troops. The main Japanese force from New Ireland landed 3 miles east of its intended landing point in the darkness and confusion. They had no accurate understanding of where they were in relation to their objective, how many Allied soldiers were waiting for them, or what the terrain between them and the airstrip actually looked like at ground level. Despite this chaotic and damaging beginning, the opening nights of the Battle of Milne Bay were genuinely close, and the outcome was not immediately obvious. The 2 Japanese tanks caused real tactical disruption because the Australians had been unable to move anti-tank guns along the swampy coastal tracks in the available time, and the improvised anti-tank grenades that infantry carried proved completely useless against moving armor in jungle conditions. Militia battalions fell back under the combined pressure of the tanks and the aggressive Japanese infantry pressing behind them. The Japanese sent confident reports to their commanders in those first days, describing progress and predicting success. These were the last confident communications they would send before the battle turned against them. Brigadier George Wooten's 18th Brigade, veterans of the Tobruk siege who knew what sustained defensive fighting under pressure actually required, moved forward into the line at Milne Bay. Australian artillery established accurate range on the Japanese positions and began to make the open ground between the jungle and the airstrip extremely costly for any Japanese movement. The Kitty Hawks flew at treetop height in repeated attacks, destroying Japanese supply dumps and strafing infantry caught in the open with a precision that denied the ground force the ammunition and food it needed to maintain any forward momentum. On the night of the 30th to the 31st of August, the Japanese launched what proved to be their final and most determined assault on the airstrip at Milne Bay. Australian artillery and mortar fire met the attack in the open ground. By morning, the assault had failed completely. And finally, and for the first time in the entire Pacific War, a Japanese amphibious assault force had been stopped at its objective, thrown back from the ground it had reached, and driven toward the sea. The pursuit that followed was relentless. On the 4th of September, as the 2nd 12th Battalion moved along the northern shore of Milne Bay in pursuit of the withdrawing Japanese, Corporal John French encountered 3 Japanese machine gun positions that had been established specifically to cover the Japanese retreat and allow their remaining men to escape. He destroyed the first 2 positions with grenades, approaching each one and eliminating the crew before moving to the next. He killed the crew of the 3rd with his submachine gun at close range, working alone throughout the entire action while under sustained fire. His section found him dead beside the last gun pit when they reached his position. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Of the 2,800 Japanese who had landed at Milne Bay with such confidence in their intelligence and their fighting ability, 1,318 were eventually evacuated by sea when the Japanese command formally acknowledged that the battle was lost and could not be recovered. Approximately 750 lay dead around the bay itself. The remainder attempted to escape through trackless jungle to reach the Japanese base at Burma on the northern coast, a journey of over 200 kilometers through terrain that was as hostile to them as it had been to the Australians on the Kokoda Track, and which destroyed most of the men who attempted it. The Kaigun Tokubetsu Rikusentai, the special naval landing forces that Japan reserved for its most strategically important operations, had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. By the 7th of September, 1942, the battle at Milne Bay was over, and the outcome was beyond any possible dispute. Field Marshal Sir William Slim commanded British and Indian forces fighting the Japanese in Burma. He was one of the most capable and clear-minded operational commanders Britain produced in the entire war. A man who understood fighting in difficult terrain against a ruthless and experienced enemy, because that was the reality of his daily existence. He understood with complete clarity what the news from Milne Bay meant when it reached him, and he understood it immediately without needing to have it explained or interpreted. He used the news to address his own soldiers directly, men who were fighting the same enemy in a different jungle on a different continent, and who were carrying the same crushing psychological burden of the belief that Japanese soldiers in jungle conditions possessed some quality that Western soldiers could not match, regardless of training or determination or courage. He told them that Australian troops had, at Milne Bay in New Guinea, inflicted on the Japanese their first undoubted defeat on land. He said that if the Australians in conditions very like their own had done it, then they could do it too. He said that some might forget that of all the Allies, it was the Australian soldiers who first broke the spell of the invincibility of the Japanese army, and that those who had been in Burma had particular cause to remember. A British Field Marshal, using an Australian battle to give his own soldiers in Burma the belief that they could win. That is the full measure of what happened at Milne Bay, and it has never been adequately reflected in the way the battle is discussed, or more accurately, in the comprehensive way it is not discussed in most of the histories that matter. While Slim's assessment was reaching soldiers in the Burmese jungle and changing the way they thought about what was possible against the Japanese, the campaign in Papua was entering its final phase and revealing, with a terrible completeness, the true cost of everything that had happened on the track. By the 14th of September, Hori's leading troops had reached Isurava Ridge, the furthest point south that any Japanese force reached in the entire Pacific War. They were 40 kilometers from Port Moresby. Standing at that altitude on a clear tropical night, Japanese soldiers could see the lights of the city burning in the valley below them. They were within actual physical sight of the objective that the entire campaign, from the beaches at Bunagona, through every battle on the track to this ridge, had been designed to capture. They stopped. On the 18th of September, Hori received the order to withdraw his forces back to the Bunagona beachhead on the northern coast. The explanation that has dominated the historical accounts ever since is the reverses at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, where American Marines were fighting a battle that was demanding Japanese reinforcements that could not simultaneously be committed to sustaining the New Guinea offensive. This explanation is historically accurate. It is not the complete truth of why the order was possible to execute. Senior Japanese officers who were interviewed after the war and asked directly to explain what had stopped the Port Moresby advance returned consistently in their testimony to a finding that the standard histories have not given adequate weight. The factor they identified most consistently as influencing the decision to halt at Isurava was not Guadalcanal alone. It was stronger than anticipated Australian resistance at Kokoda. The army that had defeated everything it had faced across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific had been delayed, exhausted, and bled at position after position on the track by men who were supposed to offer token resistance before collapsing. They hadn't collapsed. At every ridge and every creek crossing and every village from the coast to Isurava, the South Seas Detachment had paid a price in men and ammunition and time that it had not calculated and had not prepared for. The force that finally stood on that ridge and saw Port Moresby's lights was not the force that had landed at Bunagona in July. Guadalcanal provided the order that made withdrawal acceptable to Japanese high command. The Australian resistance had provided the condition that made withdrawal something other than a strategic catastrophe. The withdrawal began on the 26th of September, and from its very first days, the planned rearguard action that Hori had intended to conduct was unraveling in ways that no commander could control. The supply system that had been fragmenting since August broke completely. Australian patrols following the Japanese withdrawal found the track littered with abandoned weapons and equipment and the bodies of men who had fallen and been left where they lay. Some had died in combat with the pursuing Australians. Some had died from the starvation that the broken supply chain had made inevitable over the preceding weeks. And some, and this is the truth, that Australian soldiers who found those bodies carried with them for the rest of their lives without being able to speak of it easily, had been partially consumed by their own comrades. Japanese diaries recovered from the dead on the track recorded what had happened with a directness that makes the reader flinch even at 8 decades of distance. Some companies had been eating the flesh of Australian soldiers. We are looking for anything edible now and are eating grass, leaves, and the pith of trees. The army that had marched into Papua intending to capture an empire had been reduced by Australian resistance, and by the most difficult terrain any army had attempted to fight through in the Pacific War, and by the total collapse of its own logistical system, to consuming the bodies of the soldiers it had been unable to defeat in combat. No casualty figure and no strategic analysis captures the absolute scale of what happened on the Kokoda Track more precisely than those diary pages. The Battle of Oivi Gorari from the 4th to the 11th of November destroyed what coherent capacity for resistance remained in the South Seas Detachment. Hori had positioned 2,800 men in a defensive perimeter around Oivi village with the intention of holding long enough for an organized withdrawal to the coast. The Australians outflanked the position on multiple sides simultaneously. The perimeter collapsed into a rout. The retreat became a flight. On the 18th of November, 1942, Hori attempted to navigate the flooded Kumusi River on an improvised raft with a small party of staff officers, impatient to reach the coastal positions at Bunagona that were simultaneously under pressure from Allied forces advancing from the south. The raft became snagged on a submerged tree in the powerful current. He transferred to a canoe found at the riverbank with his orderly and his chief of staff. The canoe capsized in a tropical storm off the New Guinea coast as it reached the open sea. His orderly survived. Tomitaro Hori, the general who had expressed private doubt about the overland campaign before it began, who had executed the order anyway because duty required it, who had issued personal directives against atrocity and watched his starving army commit them, who had marched 8,500 men into the Owen Stanleys and brought out a handful, drowned in the river at the end of everything. His orderly survived long enough to report his final words. He said he had not the strength to swim any further, and asked that the troops be told that Hori died there. Long live the Emperor. In Brisbane, General Douglas MacArthur had been building a version of the campaign story that served different purposes than accuracy. The Supreme Commander, who had not visited the front in Papua until October, who had issued assessments and demands from headquarters with no direct knowledge of conditions that were destroying men by the hundreds on the track, had called Australian soldiers rabbits during the retreat phase and positioned himself as the architect of the recovery that followed. Brigadier Arnold Potts, among the most gifted tactical commanders the Kokoda campaign produced, was removed from command for conducting a fighting withdrawal from Isurava that was the only correct military decision available given his force ratios, his supply situation, and the physical state of his men after weeks of combat. Potts had preserved Maroubra force when any other course of action would have resulted in its destruction. He was sacked because the withdrawal, viewed from Brisbane with no understanding of what had produced it, looked like failure. 3 senior Australian officers were removed from command during the Papua campaign, and not one of them had failed in combat in any meaningful sense of that word. Every removal served a headquarters that needed the campaign's narrative to conform to an account of events it had not participated in creating. The 39th Battalion began the campaign at approximately 1,500 men and was relieved in September with 185. That was what victory on the Kokoda Track actually looked like when you stood on the ground where it happened. What MacArthur chose not to say, the Japanese were eventually compelled to account for in their own official record of the war they had fought and lost. The Senshi Sosho, the authoritative official Japanese history compiled in 102 volumes by Japan's Defense Studies Institute, from the complete operational and command archive of the Imperial Japanese military, pays tribute to Australian fighting soldiers in language that has no equivalent in any Allied official account of the same campaign. A documentary produced in 1992 brought Japanese veterans of the Kokoda campaign before a camera for the first time and asked them to speak about what they had experienced and witnessed in Papua. They paid, in the judgment of those who recorded their testimony, high tributes to the fighting abilities of the Australians on the Kokoda Track. These were not historians offering comfortable retrospective admiration. These were men who had faced those Australians in the actual jungle, who had filed operational reports claiming 1,200 defenders where there were 77, who had watched the finest assault infantry in the Japanese military halted and bloodied and ultimately broken by teenagers that the Allied world had dismissed as soldiers not worth taking seriously. Lieutenant General Tsutomu Yoshihara was the Chief of Staff of Japan's South Seas Army, the command with overall responsibility for the entire Papua operation. After the war ended and the accounts could finally be given without the constraints of an ongoing conflict, he offered this formal assessment of the Australians who had stopped him in Papua. He said that in the Kokoda battle, the Australian soldiers' qualities of adaptability and individual initiative enabled them to show tremendous ability as fighting men in the jungle. He said that they were superb. A Japanese general used the word superb to describe men his army had faced and could not defeat. Not adequate, not capable, not better than expected. Superb, the precise and considered word that a professional soldier with decades of operational experience reserves for the finest opposition he has encountered across an entire military career. And then came the testimony that completed the revision of the account the standard histories had been telling. The consistent finding from senior Japanese officer interviews that the Isurava decision was driven not only by Guadalcanal, but by stronger than anticipated Australian resistance at Kokoda. The army that had defeated every opponent it had faced across Southeast Asia and the Pacific had found, on a mountain track in Papua that most of the world had never heard of, something its doctrine and its confidence and its unbroken record of success had not prepared it for. Boys who dug in with bayonets and bully beef tins, a farmer who accounted for 40 men with 2 guns, a man with a shattered ankle who crawled for 3 weeks, a 23-year-old who charged an Imperial army alone and made it count with the last action of his life. These were the things that broke the Japanese calculation. None of them required sophisticated equipment or heavy support or technological advantage. They required only the refusal to accept that stopping was an available option, and the belief, irrational by every objective military standard, that conviction could substitute for everything that was missing. The effect of what happened in Papua moved through the Allied war in the Pacific in ways that the popular histories have never fully traced. Slim's soldiers in Burma knew it because he told them directly. Allied planners across the Pacific revised the foundational assumption that Japanese soldiers in jungle conditions could not be matched regardless of the determination or training of the force sent against them. That assumption had been tested against Australian militia boys on a mountain track and had produced a definitive result. Revising the assumption was not a minor adjustment to operational planning. It was the psychological precondition for everything the Allies accomplished in the Pacific over the 3 years that followed, and the doctrine of jungle fighting that those Australians created through necessity and paid for in blood at Kokoda became the template on which MacArthur built the campaign that returned him to the Philippines. He built it on what they invented. He never credited them adequately for the invention. At Isurava, on the ground where Bruce Kingsbury charged, and Charlie McCallum fought until everyone around him was gone, and John Metzen crawled for 3 weeks on a shattered ankle. 4 black granite pillars now stand. Prime Ministers John Howard of Australia and Sir Michael Somare of Papua New Guinea stood together at the memorial's unveiling in 2002, 60 years after the battle, and read the word inscribed on the stone. 1 word on each pillar, 4 words in total. Courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice, not victory, not triumph, not the ranks of generals or the tally of enemy soldiers killed. The people who chose those 4 words understood something that the histories written from safe distances consistently miss. What the Australians did on the Kokoda Track was not primarily a military achievement, though it was permanently and completely that. It was a human achievement. The demonstration, paid for without reservation, of what ordinary people can accomplish when they decide that stopping is not something they will permit themselves to do. The official histories still give Guadalcanal the largest share of credit for stopping Japan's southward advance. American textbooks rarely mention Kokoda at all. The names of the men who held those ridges and those creek crossings are not carved on monuments in Washington or London. And the story of what they accomplished, what a Japanese general called superb, what a British Field Marshal used to give his own army the courage to fight on, what the official Japanese history of the Pacific War recorded with something that reads, even through careful official language, as close to awe, remains far less known than 8 decades of distance should have allowed. But the evidence is in the archives. It is in Senshi Sosho. It is in the testimony of the officers who faced those Australians across the track and could not break them. It is in the words of a Japanese sergeant who said, half a century after the guns fell silent, that no one knew there was a hill. It is in the words of a British Field Marshal telling his soldiers in a Burmese jungle that the Australians had broken the spell, and that what the Australians had done, they could do too. 77 men were reported as 1,200. Teenagers who were supposed to melt held an Imperial army long enough to exhaust it beyond recovery, and the army that had never previously been stopped could not fully explain what had stopped it. Ralph Honor told the survivors at Minari Village that history would remember them, and that in the years to come, others would wish they had shared their conviction. He was right about both things. The only question worth sitting with now, after all of this, after all the names and all the numbers and all 4 words cut into granite at Isurava, is whether we have been paying close enough attention to understand what that conviction actually looked like when it was being lived, and what it genuinely cost every person who carried it through to the end. Tell me in the comments, what is the most overlooked battle of the Second World War that deserves a story exactly like this one? Leave your answer there, because the story we bring you next might be the one you name today. And if this one moved you, if you think the men of the Kokoda Track deserve to be known beyond Australia's borders, share it with one person who has never heard what happened in the jungles of Papua in 1942. They need to know. They really do.